Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexei the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. We're continuing our coverage of the Gaza conflict with another important voice. So we're happy to welcome to the show Layla Al-Sheikh, who is a DSA organizer and a writer on Palestinian issues. Has an article in Jacobin that just came out. I believe it was today, Friday, when we're recording this. So welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here.
Yeah, I thought, to kick the discussion off a little bit, maybe we could review sort of the latest news. So Biden has visited Israel, and it appears as though Israel is preparing an invasion, possibly. It's fairly unclear about, what precisely is going to happen. But what's your read on like the latest sort of, over the last week, basically, of what's happening in Gaza?
So I would say that in essence, what we're looking at is what I wrote in Jacobin and what I'm writing elsewhere in Dissent and some other places that will come out soon, is that this is the most volatile crisis that we're looking at since 1948, I think. It is already a deadlier event for Israelis than the entirety of the Second Intifada. And this is shaping up to be significantly deadlier than 2014 or 1988. And the psychological wounds for Palestinians are far greater than Sabra and Shatila in 1982. And yes, we are looking at a ground invasion as far as we can tell. I saw that ABC, just before coming on, I saw that ABC News reports that the Israeli military has a green light to move into Gaza, and that Barak Ravid of Axios reported immediately following Biden's visit to Israel that Biden didn't really set a parameter against a ground invasion, but rather was only looking for a defined war goal, which the Israelis did not really provide. To what extent we know that there's a war goal is very limited. Israeli officials are having a public spat with one another, the defense minister, the finance minister, over what they perceive to be a victory in this scenario. And for Gazans, we're looking at the deadliest sustained airstrike campaign ever. We're looking at mass displacements. I think AP and the Gazan Health Ministry have both reported that over 400,000 Gazans have been already internally displaced. So this is a significant refugee crisis. And then something that's under discussed, is that the occupied West Bank is on fire at the moment. Over 65 Palestinians in the occupied West Bank have been killed since the crisis began on October 7th. And settlers are rampaging throughout the region. By now it's likely more, but I haven't been able to confirm that. 2 villages, as far as I know, have been depopulated entirely. And so, at least as of recording this, we're on the precipice of a regional war. We're on the precipice of something that could be much bigger than what it already is. And I would say that's where we're looking at right now.
Yeah, I'd just like to add a comment on something I've noticed personally. This has been the biggest sort of international emergency where the total degradation of Twitter has really come to the fore. I mean, say what you like about the previous regime before Elon Musk bought it, but it used to be that you could go to Twitter and with a little bit of work, you could find an unprecedented real-time view into what was going on the ground in any sort of crisis like this. And, probably certain aspects of this conflict would have made that harder. But now Twitter, I would say, is basically worthless as far as trying to get accurate information. there's just all kinds of disinformation flying around on there. There's no way to tell really anymore, who is, actually who they say they are. The verification badges are all but worthless. It's like, you're verified to have paid $8. And anyway, I think was maybe a semi-intentional purpose of Elon Musk buying this in the first place to basically just flood the zone with shit, as Steve Bannon has said. And yeah, you really feel the absence of Twitter reporting and perspectives, and how confusing it has been, and how many different claims of like, oh, there was a hospital blown up. Was the hospital blown up by the IDF? Was it blown up by Hamas? How many people died? And all this, and people just like having these super heated arguments back and forth about stuff where you can't even find, a consistent, picture from, what actually happened. It's a real shame. Before we go on about the more about the current, crisis, you're an expert in like Palestinian history. And I thought it would be worthwhile, or in our previous episode, David Cleons, said he's, he knows the basic, like gist of things, but he's not so, read up on the details. And you mentioned 1948. Obviously, that's when Israel was, first established. But since then, basically, can you tell us a little bit about the history of Gaza and the occupation post like 1973? In 67, right? You had the 6-Day War, which Israel won easily. Then in 73, you had the Yom Kippur War, where Israel was ambushed, and it was a sort of close run thing. And then after that, you've had like this period of, basically trying to perpetuate the occupation. So can you tell us about that?
Yes. And I think this is an important node to connect to our current day because of the psychological impact, which I'll get to in a second. But as far as the history of Gaza goes, and Cleon, I think, did a wonderful job of giving a cursory introduction to the identity and importance of Gaza for Palestinians, more than I believe it's 70%, more than 70% of Gazans are direct descendants of people who were displaced by the Nakba. And since the Israeli occupation, from the Israeli occupation of around 1973 onward, the administration of Gaza, like that of the rest of the occupied territories, involved a system of fragmentation, of intentional dissolution of Palestinian civil society. And this is really when, over time, we saw the erosion of the secular nationalist movements in Fatah and in the various socialist and Marxist-Leninist and otherwise left-wing leaning organizations like the PFLP or various groups that were more self-described communistic. And this is when the Muslim Brotherhood's branch in Gaza, now known as Hamas, essentially, became very effective at establishing a social base. Something that you'll hear on Twitter, to your point about misinformation and shallow understanding. A lot of people rightfully point out that Bibi Netanyahu has a history of promoting Hamas as a means of maintaining the fracture in Palestinian politics. But not many people understand that Hamas has a genuine social base that goes back to the 1980s, goes back further, in its establishment of masjids and its establishments of charities and hospitals, and that it provided an alternative after the left wing was assassinated, sabotaged, internally fragmented over various things. And this sets the stage eventually for the Oslo world to have this dramatic split in the 2005-2006 elections, where Hamas essentially took over the Gaza Strip after Israel had ceded control in agreement with Oslo in some form of self-government, which we now know that the degradation of Oslo is in large part what has led to this engendered crisis of occupation and of apartheid.
Can you hang on? Sorry to interrupt. Can you explain what the Oslo Accords were, just in case listeners haven't heard of that?
Oh, of course. So in the late 1980s, after decades of frustration about this lack of a viable pathway for self-determination, Palestinians who had a decade prior seen a bit of a rejuvenation with regards to their political identity, insofar as going back to 1967 for a real quick second. Palestinians in Israel proper had lived for 20 years as citizens, and yet citizens who were subject to martial law, exclusively ethnic imposed martial law, only applied to them. And in 1966, that was lifted, and that gave them a new opportunity to interact with the wider Arab world. They were no longer so systematically surveilled and limited in their movement. But then, of course, in 1967, 1 year later, the occupation of the rest of historic Palestine commenced. And this had a paradoxical effect of bringing the Palestinians in the occupied territories that we know now and the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel closer together. They were now under effectively the same sovereign state's control. And those 10 years of reunification of sorts, albeit under different legal regimes, allowed for a festering of frustration, allowed for a new sense of this problem being lodged in place. And eventually the First Intifada broke out. And the First Intifada was a mixture of nonviolent, violence, decentralized protest movements. It involved village councils. It involved various political parties vying for a position as the vanguard of the Palestinian national liberation movements. And the First Intifada was largely successful in bringing people towards sympathy for Palestine. And this eventually led to the Oslo Accords in the 1990s between the PLO, which was recognized as by the UN and by the US as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and the Israeli state. And essentially what the Oslo Accords did is the Palestinian Liberation Organization recognized Israel, and in exchange was provided a degree of self-government with the promise of future talks on the establishment of a Palestinian state. And if you go back and look at contemporary criticisms of Arafat and of the PLO by men like Edward Said, or men who had served as an advisor to Arafat at one point, by men like those, one of the central criticisms of Oslo was that it didn't actually promise in ironclad terms an independent Palestinian state. And so 5 years after the creation of the first Oslo Accord, the horizon was again narrowed. And here we are in 2023 with no independent Palestinian state and a sort of Bantustan system in the West Bank. And we have the siege in Gaza, which has existed since 2006, an 18-year siege. And that is more or less the horizon that we have right now.
Sorry, Layla, you mentioned that the Oslo Accords led to Israel leaving Gaza. And so just so people understand, Israel was ruling like military rule in Gaza. And then as a result of the Oslo Accords, it became the open air prison where like they took control from the outside, but were no longer within it as they are in the West Bank. And then so that coupled with what would come in terms of all the settlements and settlers that would encroach in the West Bank and Palestinian territory. Those things, maybe you could talk a bit about how those things have accelerated the problem since and frustrated the very purpose of Oslo, right?
Yes. It's a rather paradoxical issue for Israelis and Palestinians. The evacuation in 2005 was a very traumatic experience for the Israeli settlers who lived in the area of where that line had been prior to the establishment of the current southern Israeli border. And so many on the right in Israel saw that as we can never do that again sort of thing. And so now withdrawal from the West Bank is really out of the question for them, unilaterally, so to speak. And despite the evacuation occurring, the Israelis have maintained control of food, air, sea, the electricity, quite literally everything, as far as I could think, about the Gaza Strip's functions. And this is something that has gone on for, actually more than half of my life. I'm only 22 years old, and the siege of Gaza, the permanent siege of Gaza, has lasted for 18 years. And so I do not remember a time where Gaza was not under siege. And this has done quite a many things. Gaza is over 50% impoverished. Gaza is, as you said, an open-air prison. The symbolism of Gaza to Palestinian people is in many ways the epitome of what the occupation is. You'll see people nitpick, is Gaza occupied? In all but essence, it is. And I might be incorrect about the technicalities, but I'm fairly sure the UN still considers Israel responsible for what occurs in the Gaza Strip, considering that it controls all the mechanisms of day-to-day life in Gaza. And this failure of Oslo is very apparent now in the West Bank. You might hear, if you ever go on Arabic language Twitter, for example, that Abbas is often referred to by Arabs and Israelis alike as the mayor of Ramallah. So to indicate that he doesn't have very much control at all. He's a vassal in many ways, a subcontractor of the occupation, as like magazines such as 972 might say. And so what we're really looking at is I think the closing chapter of Oslo, and this crisis, without a significant change in strategy from the United States and others, is going to lead to a new status quo. What that might look like, I'm not sure.
Right, because Oslo, the idea was a two-state solution would be the goal. And with the behavior of Israel backed by the United States, that seems less and less likely. And now maybe you have a different view, but now it seems like either a one-state solution or genocide are the options, frankly.
Yes. I would say, speaking in my own personal capacity, that I'm rather sympathetic to one-staterism. I have not been around for this idea of a viable two-state solution. I recognize that many older Palestinians and many older Jews still hold on to this peacenik-esque, we can partition sort of attitude. And in fairness to them, I think to give them the sort of benefit of the doubt, Cleon talked about the naivete of liberal Zionism, and I certainly agree, considering my perspective. But in the historical context, partition is not all that rare. It's just that the historical conditions for Israel-Palestine has more or less precluded it. And that's partly because the United States and other powers have never really been interested in providing the foundation. They've almost always been uniformly pro-Israel, that is. And so whether or not the viability of partition is dead is something that I don't think I could effectively diagnose, but I certainly would think that a one-state solution is preferable from my point of view. I think Tlaib a couple months ago, actually, she's, as far as I know, she is the only congressperson who supports a democratic equal state of both peoples between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. And she, in a sort of shocking way, expressed that she doesn't want many of these longer lasting settlements in the occupied territories to be so forcefully disrupted or uprooted just for a partition plan. And she showed a rare sort of compassion for the occupying powers, settler colonial class. I'm not sure what to make of it myself, but I think it's thought-provoking, and I think over time, one-staterism is going to be more and more attractive to people, precisely because Oslo has died and nobody is really working to sustain it anymore.
Yeah, I mean, this, sort of the logic of it. I've read an argument from Josh Marshall that like you have these two peoples that have just like such a history of bitter fighting, between them. Like, how are they possibly going to live in the same, state? But you just look at the practicalities, as Rashida Tlaib was pointing out, it's like, how is this a viable state? Like you mentioned the Bantustans before, a reference to South African apartheid, where you had these little fake countries. One of them where I lived in South Africa in a former homeland, where the homeland, quote unquote, of the Tswana people, Bophuthatswana, which is just these little fragments of territory that went all over the place. Like, how on earth are you going to, make a viable Palestinian state where it's like, on the one hand, there's just like absolutely wretchedly impoverished chunk of territory in the Gaza Strip, and then the West Bank, which is just absolutely cobwebbed with settlements all over the place. It's like the very idea, it's like some kind of Holy Roman Empire-esque little like divvies, chunks of territory that don't make any sort of consistent sense. But
yeah, really, Ryan, the only, and this is simple but not easy, the only obstacle is the ethno-supremacy, right, of Zionism, and the idea that there can't be a state that isn't Jewish ethno-nationalist, in its formation. But once you lose that, it's a big thing to lose, of course. But once you lose that, then the practicalities and possibilities seem a lot more amenable than a two-state solution, right?
Yeah. And boy, it's hard to see, but it's hard to see. Yeah. I mean, as you've been talking about, Layla, the current reality of just like indefinitely perpetuating the status quo occupation, that's been Israeli policy. That was why they were propping up Islamist groups in the 80s and 90s. And that's why Netanyahu has explicitly said that supporting Hamas is the right idea, explicitly, so that you can divide the Palestinians, classic divide and rule type stuff from like the British Empire, prevent the formation of a united Palestinian front. And like, look what that got you, and so like, maybe you need a change of policy. And maybe that brings us back to, talking about current events a little bit. Can you discuss, the Biden administration's reaction to this, because it seems like we're seeing a pretty classic, the Biden White House sort of two-faced posture on this. We had at first like total lockstep support for Israel. Then some officials started talking about, well, not every Gazan is a member of Hamas. Let's not, commit war crimes. And yet now, Biden seems to have given them a green light, except maybe saying like, well, you need a plan, for how this invasion is going to go. I don't know. What are your thoughts on how Biden's responded to this?
Well, I have two lanes for my thoughts on the Biden administration's response so far. But first I'm going to note something, and I feel bad that I don't remember the author's name off the top of my head, but I read a thought-provoking piece this morning about the comparisons between now and May 2021. And for those who may not remember, may not be aware, May 2021 was what Palestinian Arabs would call the Unity Intifada, so to speak. It's when the protests in Sheikh Jarrah exploded, and it's when Jerusalemites and everyone across Israel proper, so to speak, the 48 territories known to us, and the occupied territories, sort of unified for the first time in a long time since Land Day in the 1970s. And this then led into the Israel-Hamas war of May and June 2021. And the Biden administration's response at the time was largely to offer unconditional support in public and then use that unconditional support in public as a way of then in private trying to pull back the Israeli government from intentionally inflaming things further. And some observers think that's the case here. Obviously, the issue with that is that in this case, unlike May 2021, which was still quite awful, in this case, we have open genocidaires in government. We have people speaking of a second Nakba, both in the Likud party and in religious Zionism and in Jewish power. These are all right-wing, far-right parties. The ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, they talk of mass displacement or of sending us to Europe. This is a new reality. And even if one was able to excuse the Biden administration's theory of operation in May 2021, it's not really the same here. Offering such uncritical support from the very beginning when they were immediately calling for the demolition of Gaza or the annexation of Gaza and the mass displacement of all those who live there, quite obviously not very good. From my perspective as a Palestinian and as a Palestinian American, it's very heartbreaking. It's not like I expect much from a center-left president, from someone who ran on a pretty milquetoast liberal Zionist-esque platform. But as a Palestinian personally, it remains daunting that this is what the leader of my country is doing in relation to my homeland. As a socialist, as a DSAer, I have to remember that everyone has a relationship to power and that this president's shift, albeit small thus far, is in response to the growing dissent within the Democratic Party. I wrote a piece in July with Foreign Policy about how the growing discontent among young people is not just because Bibi Netanyahu is infatuated with the right wing of the United States, of the Republican Party, of Trump, but also because young Americans are growing up at a time where Black Lives Matter is at the forefront of their minds. They're growing up at a time where there are multiple Muslim women in Congress. They're growing up at a time where AOC is one of the leading voices of democratic socialist thought. And they're hearing over and over again stuff that's more accurate to the reality of Palestinians, that this is a system of apartheid according to B'Tselem and the Human Rights Watch and Amnesty and the United Nations, that this is a systematic regime across both sides of the Green Line. And so I think that this demonstrates that Biden has a new balancing act to make. If I recall, and I'll have to disclaim that I don't remember off the top of my head, more young Americans, young Democratic voters from the age 18 to 34 disapproved of Biden's handling of the Gaza war in May 2021 than approved. That is a significant number. And as far as I understand, it's not really changing this time around. More young Democrats are disapproving than one would have expected. And that's going to have an impact over time. And that's why I find the not all Gazans are Hamas thing to be a pretty funny talking point, but that's why it's something they're saying now.
That was very interesting, that piece, Layla. I especially was struck. It made sense to me that the demographics in the United States, the younger the generation, the more pro-Palestinian and the group was. I was surprised to see that young evangelical Americans, however, also shifted from like 60-something% to 33% support of the occupation. That did strike me as very different and surprising and interesting. But I think old people like Biden, they're being told by their staffers. That's one of the benefits of Twitter and I think TikTok and all these things, is that it becomes much more apparent to the people running the show, the staffers, what the sense is, right? And yeah, so go ahead and maybe speak to that a little bit.
Well, I think I'm sure you both saw, and I think I mentioned it in the Jacobin piece, 400 or so, perhaps it's more now, 400 or so congressional staffers signed on to a letter, Muslim and Jewish. I think it's noteworthy that it's a Muslim and Jewish staff letter demanding a ceasefire. And I don't think in the grand scheme that's actually representative of so many offices, but I think it's representative of a significant amount in the Democratic caucus. And that this represents something real happening. The State Department official, Josh Paul, resigned. And what's noteworthy to me, is that he's not been isolated, so to speak, from the people who still work there. The people who still work there are reaching out to him, according to him. They're continuing to express discontent. The Huffington Post said that there's a quote unquote mutiny brewing in the State Department over this. And yes, my friend, Abe Silverstein in New York, who works for the Abraham Initiatives, have noted many times that this is also going to become a problem for future Democratic administrations when it comes to staffing people in the State Department. Many young people do not adhere to this blob mind speak, so to speak, about the occupation. In fact, the Republicans, I forget her name or his name, I don't remember. The Republicans held up a nomination for someone in the State Department for months on end because of tweets that they had made criticizing the Israeli regime. And then eventually the Biden administration withdrew it. I was pleasantly surprised they even put this person forward, but the Republicans dropped it, forced them to drop it. And so this is going to become a problem far beyond Biden. And I think that's why even Thomas Friedman of the New York Times a while ago, maybe a couple months ago, said that Biden might be the quote unquote last pro-Israel Democrat. I'm not as optimistic as Mr. Friedman, but he's significantly to our right. So I suppose he might have something to say there.
It's probably relevant, too, that not only is Biden being pushed and feeling the pressure domestically, but other foreign leaders, Arab states, European states, are also seeing these mass protests, of their people. And people are not happy with the lack of leadership and action to stop the ethnic cleansing, the genocide. It might not be a majority of people here, there, or otherwise, but in politics, it doesn't have to be a majority. A vocal activist minority can do a lot of things, especially when connected internationally.
Yes. Something that a lot of people tend to misunderstand about the Arab world in particular is that it is certainly true that the Arab regimes don't care very much about Palestine. They are autocratic. They have a capitalist structure. They care about normalization for economic purposes. But the Arab people, for a variety of reasons, historic, related to Pan-Arabism, just related to an affinity for affinity to the decolonial cause, so to speak, still very much care about Palestine. And we're seeing the largest protests in Egypt and in Iraq since the Arab Spring. And I can't make a definitive comment on what happened with the hospital. I think a lot of people jumped the gun. But what I can say about the hospital attack is that now for Arabs, it matters that it burned in any case. And the frustration about the siege has spilled over, and the reason why the King of Jordan and the President Sisi of Egypt canceled that summit is because they understand that if they were to meet with the President of the United States, who is so openly pro-Israel, it would not be good for them. It's not a politically tenable position. They still are holding behind the scenes talks. They still want to supply aid. They still want to mitigate the worst excesses of this possible regional war. But we are at a point where the U.S.'s reputation is suffering deeply among Arabs. And then in Europe, of course, you might have seen that France banned certain forms of demonstrations, and then French people all go out anyway in massive droves into Paris. And likewise, the photo criminalization of pro-Palestinian demonstrations in Berlin doesn't really prevent Jewish Berliners from coming out or Arab Berliners from coming out. So this is certainly evoking a response that political leaders may not have expected. And it proves that even after 75 years or 56 years, if that's your preference for reference point, people still care about Palestine. And I think they'll continue to.
Yeah, in that context, can you talk a little bit about the international diplomatic context or geostrategic context, maybe is a better word for it? Because like, as you've been mentioning, you can sort of see the cold-blooded realpolitik, reasons for Biden to support Israel, like Americans historically have been more pro-Israel. There's been some polling out saying that, most, like, the plurality of people think that Biden's doing a good job, and then like another 32% say he's not being aggressive enough in backing Israel, though whether or not he could actually get that support, but in any way, is probably questionable. But setting aside the sort of like immediate details, or whether like Israel is justified in like sort of attacking back at Hamas, you could really see this becoming a horrible, just another festering disaster that goes on and on. Like Hezbollah could get involved in a war. Or even just a war itself. If Israel invades, you're looking at possibly brutal house to house fighting. That was, if you look at the 2004, like the Battle of Fallujah, where it was just like street by street, an incredibly dense and dangerous place, fighting irregulars, that would no doubt inflict probably thousands of casualties on the Israeli military. And then, as you say, it's like you're looking at massive backlash across the Arab world. And, it's not hard to see how that might, inspire a revival of kind of the old fashioned Islamist terrorism, in the Al-Qaeda mold, which, thankfully has been relatively quiet over the last decade or so. And so, if I'm Biden, surely I'm looking at this and being like, oh boy, like maybe this seems like politically sensible now, but it could go really bad. And in a similar, like, it reminds me of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, or it was like everybody hated him for doing that. It was really, unpopular and humiliating to just sort of like eat that punch and just be like, we can't do this occupation anymore, because if we keep doing it, it's going to be worse. It's going to be even more unpopular and bloody and terrible. Do you think there's any sort of potential for that sort of reasoning to come in, either from, the Biden administration or Europe, which I'm sure views the prospect of like another 4 million Palestinian refugees being like dumped onto Greece and Italy with abject horror. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, I think this is really, as much as I would like to think personally that the domestic coalitional forces is the primary pressure point for the Biden administration. I think we're getting there to some extent, but I think the real pressure for the Biden administration is preventing this from expanding into Lebanon and expanding into Syria, and expanding into a Iran versus Israel open war. And I don't think anyone really wants this to happen. Iran is talking a big game. Hezbollah is talking a big game. These are in large part because they're obligated to, for their political basis, for their social basis. And Israel certainly does not want does not want a repeat of the last war that it had with Hezbollah, where it was not a win for really anybody, but it was widely viewed as a very disappointing moment for Israel. And so that's part of why the Biden administration wants a defined war plan. I was actually pleasantly surprised, as someone who's repeatedly disappointed by this president, that he publicly warned against annexation of territory in Gaza Strip. I think he did this partly because there are ministers openly speaking of annexation. The defense minister and the finance minister have both flirted with it publicly and on the Israeli army radio. But also because I think he genuinely, to whatever extent he's willing to pursue it, he genuinely thinks that a partition eventually would be good for the interest of the United States. It's a shame that this belief does not seem to be prioritized over this obsession with Saudi and Israeli normalization, though, which is at the crux of this triangulation against Iran. And for those who don't know, the thrust of the Biden administration's policy since early 2021 has been to expand the Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords were not his, they were Trump's initially, and he wants to crown an achievement by making what's already a de facto relationship into a de jure one between the Saudis and the Israelis by promising everything under the moon, possibly a civilian nuclear program, possibly a mutual defense treaty with this theocracy in the Arabian Peninsula. And so, yes, I think this will require a reconfiguration if they want to avoid disaster. To what extent they're going to do so is beyond me, though.
Yeah, the other thing, by the way, to mention about this is that, you know, the Biden administration is already dealing with a big war in Europe, namely the war between Russia and Ukraine. And we've been seeing some of the artillery shells that were earmarked to go to Ukraine now being delivered to Israel instead, you know, which not only is sort of like harming their one, you know, trying to back Ukraine from fighting off the Russians, but now is harming they've made some sort of, I don't know, semi half-hearted efforts to like build support for defending Ukraine in the global South, which is quite skeptical for like understandable historical reasons of this, you know, regards it as like sort of an inter-imperialist conflict, whatever the perception is. But now, you know, backing Israel to the hilt is like gravely damaging that effort. Do you see that playing it all into their thinking?
It's very odd to me that this administration, it's not particularly surprising, but it is odd to me that this administration has so quickly reoriented its priorities. I can't speak to the specificities of the Biden administration's policy on Ukraine, but this rapid maneuvering back towards supplying Israel with so much of what it needs for a ground invasion is actually surprising to me when you look at the polling. I don't think the polling for arms transfers to Israel is particularly all that more popular than arms transfers to Ukraine. And so whatever the political calculations may be domestically are beyond me. In terms of international calculations, I do think they genuinely believe to some extent that Israel is a very important bulwark, both as a democracy, so to speak. Of course, we know that it's not really one because a democracy of one nation over another is not a democracy. A democracy to speak, and also a bulwark against Iran. That's the primary guiding light of this administration. And so that's why they're even entertaining a mutual defense treaty with the Saudis. It's something that really, that's one of the things I've been focusing on quite a bit over the last year. It's just something that beggars belief. Even many prominent members of the blob, so to speak, have asked themselves, why is this even on the table? It doesn't really, it seems counterintuitive even to the most realpolitik, cynical person's view. But the Biden administration is pursuing it anyway, and seems to still be doing so. The State Department said a couple of days ago that they're still confident that a deal can be finalized.
Just to put a bow on the Saudi, discussion, the idea is crazy to me. It's like you have this like merciless dictator running this just like abject right-wing theocracy who's a close ally of Vladimir Putin. who chopped up a Washington Post columnist, in cold blood, and is all but openly trying to use the oil supply to like manipulate United States politics. And it's like what are we doing here? And as you say, it's a mystery. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you, Alexei.
No, it goes to the same point I'm making, because as leftists, one way that we're, I think, successful in supporting mass politics that shift kind of the terrain of what's possible politically is by kind of deflating the normative camouflage or cover that liberals and liberal administrations or reactionary administrations use to prop up the realpolitik. And so, it's important to people like Biden to claim to be on the right side of things when they stand with Israel or when they proclaim that they're fighting for democracy. But in these kind of circumstances, it's not all that hard for leftists to point out that, hey, ethnic cleansing and genocide, that's not that's not the same thing as being pro-democracy and pro-human rights and pro-freedom and pro-self-determination. And the contrast with Ukraine becomes really stark, as you pointed out, Layla, there. And it's never really been the case that it's easy to pull off empire in the United States without pretending, without the empire pretending it's doing a good thing. And it's much harder to get away with those things once it's so clear that the powers that be are on the wrong side. And so what do you think, Layla, about the potential here for mass politics and for leftists, and maybe in the context of being a DSA organizer, is it a matter of radicalizing liberals and popping the balloon of the status quo consensus about the kind of normative situation? And you can think of other successful shifts in history in the civil rights movement and other places where like people just kind of wake up to the reality of the situation and the evil that's going on in a way that doesn't make it so easy for the elites in power to get away with it, as easily at least.
Yes, I certainly think so. Obviously, within DSA, we have many internal conversations about what is base building and where is our audience first and foremost to build that base and then expand. And we all have our individual views on that. But with regards to Palestinian liberation, at least, I think it's very clear that there's a great opportunity in light of the Black Lives Matter movements, in light of the this resentment against Trumpism that really developed from 2017 onwards, against Islamophobia, against anti-Arab sentiment, against anti-African sentiments. I think all of this is cohering together in some way where many people who would identify as liberals, but not necessarily as socialists or as left-wingers, recognize that there's a connection between this myopic, dystopian, even fascistic conservatism in the United States, and also the ruling class's obscene wealth. Men like Trump, men like Ron DeSantis, these are not working class men, and they prey on people, and they use these anxieties and they use these bigotries to apply pressure to the working class's ability to unite. And so with regards to Palestinian liberation, now more than ever, people have access to information about what happens in Gaza and the West Bank and in Jerusalem. Now more than ever, people are looking at what happens to the average Palestinian under the day-to-day life of Jewish supremacy. And they say, this is not all that different from what a black person might have experienced 50 years ago, what a black person in some cases experiences now. One of the biggest issues in 2021 that contributed to this almost sea change of opinion among young people is that George Floyd was murdered within 2 weeks of a Palestinian who was intellectually disabled, if I remember right, in Jerusalem by Israeli police. And this direct parallel is easy to draw. And once, like you said, Alexei, that that veneer collapses, people flood in, I think. And it's our responsibility as left-wingers, as democratic socialists, as members of a mass organization to show up to those people who see that that veneer has fallen and to present them with a positive vision for change. Because if we're not doing that, then we're leaving them out in the cold.
That's right. And there's a lot of hope with young people. I teach college-age students, and I noticed that I think as much as there's the obvious polarization in media and otherwise, there's an underappreciation of how popular Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black life has been among young people, and at least in my experience teaching college students, and the association with Palestinian Lives Matter, I think was a brilliant kind of proxy for young people who don't know a lot about the politics or the history, but through the comparison to Black Lives Matter and Palestinian Lives Matter, immediately grasp the kind of stakes and who is being victimized by whom and all of these things. It becomes easy to understand and have a pathway into understanding the dynamics of the injustice. And just a small anecdote. I even had a student who was a Trump supporter, but who it was actually kind of comical, was just twisting herself into a pretzel in order to say that voting for Trump was not incompatible with being a Black Lives Matter supporter, as she was.
That's fascinating. That's fascinating.
Isn't that interesting? Because for her, it was yeah. So I think that, and that's why when I read about evangelical young people, that huge drop in support for Israel, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if that's connected there, because the timing seems similar. So young people are a lot more fluid. There's a lot of possibility. There's a lot less history and status quo kind of entrenched ideological baggage to have to undo, I guess, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think for evangelicals, I think a large part of it is that they're becoming more diverse racially and ethnically, and they're exposing themselves to one another. And tangentially, with regards to this veneer of reality, something that's been especially striking to me as a Palestinian Arab is that, in DSA and in any socialist circle, you're going to come around to a lot of Jewish comrades who have strong principles and who understand the role and the struggle. And something that's really fascinating to me, and something that's that instills me with a sense of love for my Jewish comrades, is that now more than ever, likewise, something that I said at convention earlier this year as a delegate, and something that I said last night to a panel of DSAers, is that it's never been a better time, despite the recent media backlash and political backlash, to be a Palestinian liberation organizer, to be a supporter of this. And likewise, it's never been a better time to be a Jewish anti-occupation activist in the United States. If not now, is an excellent organization. And even at organizations like J Street, and something that's not particularly left-wing, they identify as liberal Zionists. There's reporting at Jewish Currents, there's reporting at other organizations that demonstrate that younger J Streeters, younger members of these groups, young people at the ADL, I saw yesterday that a relatively senior official at the ADL resigned over Greenblatt's statements against If Not Now and JVP. These are young Jews who are frustrated with this unreality, so to speak, that there's this Israel that does not exist. And they have a love for Jews who live between the Mediterranean and Jordan. They have a love for Eretz Yisrael, which is a distinct thing from the state of Israel. And because they have a love for that, they also have a love for equality and for democracy, and for whether it be a state of all of its citizens or two states of equals, they have a love for the Palestinian comrades. And I think that veneer is collapsing, and it makes it all the much more difficult for people to attack Palestinian liberation as a movement.
Right, and label it anti-Semitic, which is a go-to kind of ad hominem attack. Yeah,
absolutely. I found it striking, and I think this is why the ADL staffer, forgive me for not remembering his name, why he resigned. I found it striking that Greenblatt actually labeled if not now in JVP, as the photo inverse of white supremacism. I think on the contrary, and I think that's a direct quote, I think on the contrary, being an opponent of racial supremacy, whether it be white, black, Arab, or Jewish, makes you the opposite of a white supremacist. It makes you a proponent of democracy and of workers' rights and so much more. And so obviously he lashes out because a Jew who has a different opinion from him is a threat to to the status quo that he supports.
Yeah. Boy, if there's anything this conflict has demonstrated, it's that, the critique of Zionism from many, like Edward Said, as you were saying, or even lefty Jews like Tony Judd, is Zionism is basically no different at the end of the day from all the 19th century nationalisms, and it carries all the same terrible problems. And has produced in this Israeli government people who, not to put too fine a point on it, quite resemble Nazis, and in some cases describe themselves as fascist. And like, if that's not a demonstration of the sickness of what nationalism is, taken to its extremes, I can't think of anything else that could possibly do it.
And you would think the obvious, like, pro-democracy, not just pro-leftist, but for the ideals of even this country, the putative ideals of this country, that the obvious thing would be like, how about neither Palestinian nor Jews are ethnically cleansed? How about they all have equal rights, freedom, equality, and the ability to flourish together in a pluralistic state that doesn't say that any nationality, ethnicity is supreme, but allows for human rights to be protected and for flourishing to exist among people of differences. Like, you couldn't think of something that should fit with our ideals more than that, and yet that seems to be the complete opposite of the actual policies of this country. And it's something that I think over our long history, radicals have used the actual ideals as against the obvious, like, contrary reality politically in order to slowly and sometimes radically shift the terrain to make the reality match the ideals more and more and more. And I think that this is just another battleground for that international leftist, battle to continue, right?
Yes, and I think something that Ryan said reminds me, and I talked about this with a group of wonderful democratic socialists in DSA roughly a week ago, is that something that I often see come up as a Palestinian is The Wretched of the Earth as a book. A wonderful book, a really powerful, influential book for people who believe in a post-colonial world of, so to speak, a democratic world. But a lot of people don't really read past the first chapter. A lot of people only read on violence. You see a lot of people say, oh, well, armed resistance in all forms is justified. You just have to read Fanon's argument in armed violence. And it's weird to treat this as a Bible and then not go to the section where he very clearly outlines and interrogates how nationalism as a liberatory force can quickly transform into a system which then can impose oppression onto itself. And I'm drawing a blank right now on the great subcontinental author, I think Pakistani author, who worked with Fanon, and it was a friend of Said and a mentor to Said. But he notes in a wonderful documentary that I rewatched a while ago on BBC, that Fanon was almost prophetic in this sense. Look at what happened to Algeria after independence. Look what happened to working class Algerians. Look what happened across the wider Arab world and in Syria and in Iraq. And in a way in Palestine with the establishment of this subcontractual occupation force with Abbas and with the Palestinian Authority. And so the lesson to learn as a left-wingers, as democratic socialists, is that yes, national liberation, but national liberation which is directly tied to democracy and equality for all of the inhabitants of the land. And so if you're a democratic socialist, I don't think we can endorse this indiscriminate form of violence. Certainly there's discussion to be had about strategic violence. There's a discussion to be had about intra-military force. No one can really disclude that unless they're ironclad pacifists. But I don't think you can seriously subscribe to a democratic socialist worldview and then advocate murdering civilians, to put a blunt point on it, I suppose.
Yeah. No, Fanon is, as much as there's normative claims throughout, he's also doing the psychoanalytic bit is diagnostic of like, this is what happens when you colonize and terrorize people. So it's kind of a descriptive, like explanatory thing of like, this is going to be the consequence. And he's not saying that that's good necessarily, because it's in a way, it's a kind of, a warning to not become, the same as your oppressor, and not to just, keep the cycle of violence going. And I think, as you've written about so well, the true alternative to simply shifting the terrain of who oppresses whom and who does violence to whom is to end the root cause and end the occupation here in a way where peace and justice replace the cycles of violence. And I think that should be a clear goal and a kind of prefigurative politics for leftists, where who we are being and fighting justice and fighting for justice and against injustice is as important as the specific kind of enemies of the moment, because it's so important to remain clear on why we're fighting and for what principles. And if leftists, we don't value human life, then we become, somewhat indistinguishable from the fascists at that point. And here on Left Anchor, we want to anchor ourselves in the right kind of values and principles. So I appreciate you saying that, Layla.
Yes. I am, last night I was one of the closing speakers on this panel, and I had the great honor of reading a section from a piece published in the New York Times yesterday by the member of the Knesset for the Hadash Tal list, Ayman Odeh, who is a Palestinian Arab, who is a citizen of Israel. And he quoted a doctor from Gaza, or a Gazan doctor at the very least. I don't remember if he's still in Gaza at the moment. But the only real revenge to murder is peace. And I think that's something that democratic socialists, whether they be Palestinian or Jewish or otherwise, need to center in the logic of liberation. And that if we're going to build this mass movement that we're talking about, that we're trying to articulate to people, that we're trying to replace the veneer of reality with, then that's essential. In my view, anyway.
Yeah, I think that's it's probably a pretty good place to stop it. But yeah, Layla Al-Sheikh, thanks for coming on the show. Much appreciate your informed perspectives and an update on the situation.
Thank you for having me.
Do you want to plug anything before we let you go?
Yes. Final thoughts. There will be a free Palestine in my lifetime, where Jews and Palestinians will live in equality and under democratic rule. I will go home to that land one day. I am sure of it. I'm sure that many of you who are listening will be a part of this movement to create it. And if you have the opportunity and you spare money, I have a PCRF, Palestine Children Relief Fund, donation page set up. We are roughly $10,000 away from our goal. We'll make sure that that's linked somewhere. I don't know how that works, but we'll make sure. And thank you for inviting me on. I appreciate it.
Of course.
Wonderful.
Yeah, we'll put that link in the show notes, definitely. But yeah, so from your mouth to God's ear, let's hope. And thanks for listening, everybody. We'll see you in the next episode.